All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us for a few minutes as we get sort of fired up here on a Monday morning. My name is Mike Albertson. I am the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your schedule to join us, or for those who are watching the video later, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. Today, we're going to have, as part of the CGSR lecture series, a talk by Dr. Yun Sun, who's Director of the China Program at the Stimson Center. And she's going to present a talk titled Xi's Grand Strategy in U.S.-China Relations. So we have been having a lot of talks on China recently, which is no surprise because everyone is talking about great power competition. Everyone is talking about sort of China as the pacing threat, even though there are a lot of other events taking place in the world that sort of distract from the pacing threat. People still say we should focus on China. And this competition has two sides, right? On the one hand, you have the United States. The United States' foreign policy, how we're seeing ourselves in the world, how that role is changing, how that role is evolving. But people forget there's a Chinese side to this equation, and the U.S. cannot simply sort of dictate its will as it sees fit. There is another side with another side's grand strategy that's taking place. So we're very fortunate to have the speaker that we do today to present on this. And the last time I saw her in person was at a tabletop exercise where she was literally playing Xi Jinping as part of the exercise. So now she gets to tell us what his grand strategy is, even though she was playing him a year ago at a tabletop I was at. So let me say a little bit about the speaker. She is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. Her expertise, if you Google her, is on Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. From 2011 to 2014, she was a visiting fellow at Brookings, jointly appointed by the Foreign Policy Program and the Global Development Program, where she focused on many of these topics. Prior to that, she was a China analyst at the International Crisis Group, based in Beijing, specializing in China's foreign policy. And prior to that, she worked on U.S.-Asia relations in Washington, D.C. for 5 years, and she got her PhD from School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. So ground rules for those who might be here this summer and are sort of new to the CGSR lecture experience. So our speaker is going to talk for 30 to 45 minutes. At any point in the conversation, raise your hand electronically. Type your questions in the chat. Just make sure they go to me, or they go to all the panelists. And that way, we can get the discussion rolling as quickly as possible when she's done with her remarks, and we can jump right into your questions. So at any point in time, something interests you, like put that question in, put the hand up, and we'll be ready to go when the time comes. So over to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and really looking forward to this presentation.
Thank you so much, Director Albertson. It's really good to be here, and thank you for the invitation to share some of my research on China's relationship with the world, and also especially China's relationship with the United States. So the idea of Xi Jinping's centrism is now new, but it originated from the question that we have seen that since Xi Jinping took over China in 2013, that was 12 years ago, China has come up with a number of striking foreign policy initiatives. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was launched in 2013, and the concept of a community of common destiny for the whole mankind, which was introduced in 2014. And in more recent years, we have seen the initiatives such as the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and the most recent reincarnation is called the Global Civilization Initiative. So the question is, what does Xi Jinping mean by all these concepts? And what is he really trying to achieve at the end game from all these concepts that are essentially instruments to a goal? They're means to an end, but they're not the ends itself. So the question I ask myself is that what exactly is Xi Jinping trying to achieve in terms of the end game that he envisions? What is the role that China is trying to play through all these concepts? And of course, there's a cynical view. You could say that, oh, never mind, all these are propaganda. All these are whitewashing Xi Jinping has presented to the world in order to induce or to convince the world to go into a direction that China would like to see, and that is a very real possibility. But even for this propaganda, even if these are propaganda, this still has to have a logic, right? It still has to be persuasive in order to convince the rest of the world, or at least China's neighbors, that this is a desirable system or desirable international arrangement that the other countries should aspire to. So in my view, in my research, I think what Xi Jinping is essentially presenting or trying to persuade the world to undertake or to take on is the only international relations system that China has ever known historically. And it is also the only system that China had ever had an upper hand. So I think for Xi Jinping to present the world with this vision, he is essentially trying to return China to its historical or its ancient glory, based on an international system that China had known too well historically for about 2,000 years. And this is a system that China enjoyed, and this is a system that China wants to return to. But here are some problems. So we're no longer living in the historical, 2,000 years ago, the ancient international affairs system. And the most distinct difference between the Asian system and what we currently have now is the Westphalian system that has been established since 1648. So historically, if you look at China, China was not a country. China called itself, I'm sorry?
Would you like me to advance your slides?
Not yet. I'm not there yet.
Okay.
I'm still in the opening remarks, so I'll get there. So historically, what the Chinese have called the Middle Kingdom or the Central Kingdom, China was not a country or was not a nation. In particular, it was not a sovereign nation. China historically is regarded more as a civilization, but was governed by the Middle Kingdom. So, which is why that when China look at the more recent or the more contemporary Westphalian system based on nation states, that's where the Chinese system collides with the modern system of international affairs. And that's also, I believe, what Xi Jinping has been trying to grapple with through his foreign strategy. And another difference between today and the historical China experience is also the fact that the United States is indeed the sole hegemon in the international system today. So how does China deal with the issue of the United States currently, and how U.S. as an obstacle in China's journey to return to what Xi Jinping would perceive as a Sino-centric international system? That's the biggest problem for China today. So I'm ready for the first slide. Thank you, Katie. So when we look at China, the concept of Sinocentrism, in Chinese is called 天下, and 天下literally translated is all under heaven. So everything under heaven is under the benevolence or the rule and the governance of the emperor of the Middle Kingdom. And when you look at this map, it's essentially a concentric circles. That in the most inner circle is the emperor, is the royal court represented by the emperor, and around the emperor is the inner subjects that are regarded as the nationals of China, and then is outside the inner subjects is the outer subjects, which were called basically the people from the frontier. And then beyond the frontier is the tributary states. So if we look at the history in the Chinese definition, nation states today, such as Vietnam, North Korea, South Korea, not really Japan, because Japan is separated by waters, but countries like Mongolia, countries in Southeast Asia, they're all seen as a member of the tributary system. And beyond the tributary states, they're barbarians. And they're literally called barbarians. They're northern barbarians, eastern barbarians, southern barbarians, and western barbarians. And this is the traditional concept of the Chinese mapping of the international system. And beyond the barbarians, you might ask what were in existence beyond the barbarians. In the Chinese historical books, beyond the barbarians, they're animals. So if you look at China's traditional vision of an ideal world order, is it resembles hegemonic stability, but with a very different moral codes or moral norms to the hierarchy. So the concept of 天下 all under heaven is key to the Chinese political culture since the ancient Zhou dynasty, which was 1046 BC. And the vision basically is about a world centered on and dominated by a superior, materially superior, and morally benevolent country or slash civilization, the Middle Kingdom. And the hegemon's superiority in military and economic power forms a foundation for peace and stability through deterrence and coercion. And the moral superiority, as primarily demonstrated by the hegemon's benevolent provision of public goods, anchors the desirability of the hegemonic hierarchy among other states. So when China looks at looks around China from the emperor's point of view, the emperor essentially sees himself as a hegemon, that he enjoys superior military and economic power, and he uses his moral superiority demonstrated by the hegemon's ability to provide public goods. Think about the Belt and Road Initiative to the rest of the system in order to demonstrate that this system is desirable. Next slide, please. So when we think about the Middle Kingdom, just think about the theory of hegemonic stability and everything becomes explainable. The principle of the hegemonic stability is deeply embedded in Chinese philosophical subscription to Confucianism. So despite its emphasis on morality and harmony, Confucianism installs a strictly defined hierarchical order politically, economically, and socially. And here we can go to the next slide just very quickly to demonstrate that the type of hierarchy that Confucianism is based on and the type of hierarchy China's international relations theory is based on. So when you look at Confucianism, the world is harmonious, not because everyone is created equal. The emperor is definitely not equal to the peasants, but the world is harmonious because everyone will strictly abide by and stick to its own position and its own role in the hierarchy. So in other words, the hierarchy is harmonious, not because everyone is created as the same, but because there is a very strictly enforced order that if everyone sticks to the role designed or appointed to them, then the system is harmonious. So which is why that in the Chinese concept of the world order, harmony does not originate from equality. Remember, if you look at China's foreign policy today, harmony in South China Sea does not originate from the fact that all countries from China to Vietnam are created equal. In fact, if you recall what the Chinese used to say back in 2010, the Chinese foreign minister used to say, well, China is a big country and you're all small, two Southeast Asian countries, and that is a fact. So the concept of order in the Chinese system comes from a well-enforced hierarchical roles and responsibility assigned according to actors' material and moral competence. So harmony is ensured because actors abide by their designated role without seeking to challenge the order. Reflecting international relations, the vision stipulates that peace and stability happen when and only when states recognize and pledge their deference to the strong and morally benevolent hegemon and observe the rules and the systems developed by the hegemon. When the existing hegemon is weakened or eliminated, the stability of the system crumbles. So, hi, Katie, can we go to the previous slide, please? Thank you. So the Chinese concept of Middle Kingdom is in essence identical to the Western notion of a hegemon. The Middle Kingdom historically possessed economic and political preponderance in the region, including the size of China's territory, including its large economy, including its civilizational supremacy, political strength, and military force. The Middle Kingdom established a hegemonic regime, and this is the tributary system, the concentric the circles that we're looking at. The tributary system organized around the hierarchy of concentric circles with a hegemon in the center, and the provinces, vassal states, and the tributary states on the periphery. The Middle Kingdom possessed both the capability and the will to enforce a hierarchical order and a hegemonic system by countering challenges and push through diplomacy, through coercion, through persuasion, and sometimes through rewards. So the moral norms and the model of the Middle Kingdom forms the normative rules of the system. Such moral norms, in China's view, requires, for example, tolerance and harmonious coexistence of different cultures, religions, ethnicities, and the governance systems. Ideally, the harmonious coexistence is based on a shared vision of stability and prosperity among all members of the system, although the enforcement of such an order relies on the coercive power by the hegemon. So in this sense, China sees itself as both the endogenous and the exogenous factor to the desired world order, because its hegemonic dominance is both the character and also the guarantee of the system. So this is the only international system that China had known historically, and also placed China at an advantaged position. Through what we see as 2,000 years of China's written history, this is a system that China has consistently tried to pursue and try to impose on the rest of the periphery. So you might recall that South Korea or the Korean Peninsula historically claimed that it has been invaded by China by 900 times, and Vietnam would claim that China historically invaded Vietnam for 2,000 times. So this constant friction between China as a Middle Kingdom and the other tributary states on its periphery is a friction of this different views of the world order as China sees it. China sees itself as a hegemon, obligated by the heaven. Remember, the emperor of China names himself the son of the heaven. So they see themselves as implementing or carrying out the heavenly mandate to exert China's civilization, a superior civilization, on the barbarians. Remember why the Chinese call all these countries or all the peoples living on China's periphery as barbarians. So the Chinese see themselves as having an obligation to educate and civilize these barbarians on its periphery. But these people on the periphery are not necessarily seen as the most essential people that the central court or the Middle Kingdom needs to exert direct rule. So let's move forward, 2 slides forward, please. 1 and 2. So we come to Xi Jinping. When Xi Jinping stepped into power in 2013 in China, China was at a very interesting stage in terms of its diplomacy, because in the previous decade, China just experienced extremely high level growth. Between 2007 to 2010, China experienced double-digit growth. So when Xi Jinping came into power, he found China to be extremely wealthy. China had the largest foreign reserve in the world at that time. It was close to 3.3 or 3.4 trillion US dollars. But the problem that Xi Jinping identified at that time was twofold. The first one is on the economic front. So you might recall that back in 2008, when there was the international financial crisis, China's most immediate response was a domestic stimulus package. The Chinese call it the 4 trillion RMB domestic stimulus package. And it was with this domestic stimulus package that China was able to build all the high-speed railway system in China, all the airport networks in China that goes to second tier, third tier, even fourth tier cities in China. So this basically was a period of extreme infrastructure development growth between 2008 to 2012. The 4 years before Xi Jinping stepped into power. So when Xi Jinping stepped into power, the problem of that stimulus package started to emerge. And what is the problem? The problem is China realized that there's only that many high-speed railway you can build domestically. And with the stimulus package and with China's domestic construction infrastructure development sectors being put on steroid, China very quickly, the market was saturated. And China was ending up with a problem that we're still dealing with today that is named overcapacity. The excess of China's capacity started a long time ago. It's the excess of the capacity is not necessarily a new problem. So when China looks at its combination of its economic realities, on one hand, there's overcapacity of most sectors related to infrastructure development, and on the other hand, China no longer has a market for these capacities to go into. But at the same time, China does enjoy the largest foreign reserve in the whole world. So when you put 1 + 1 and +1 together, it came out an economic answer that is called Belt and Road Initiative. So the essential economic logic of Belt and Road Initiative is that China is going to use its own policy banks funding to support the export of China's contracting services, China's infrastructure development services, and export Chinese labor, export Chinese products to countries need infrastructure but are not able to finance them. So in order to square the circle, there are several elements. One, there's Chinese policy funding provided or supported by China's foreign reserve. And two, this funding is used to export the Chinese products and Chinese services. And the only missing link is where are they going? And the Belt and Road countries are where they are going. So these are essentially developing countries, as we can see from the map, that have been historically unable to obtain international financiers' favor or their support for the infrastructure development, even including organizations like World Bank or IMF or Asian Development Bank. They're unwilling to support these type of infrastructure projects, not because there's not enough projects to support. There is a dire need for more funding in the international infrastructure development domain, but because these projects are not always regarded as commercially viable, either because of these countries' domestic political reality, the poor investment environment, or because of potential risks such as political risks or war risks. Now we have China answering the question with Chinese own policy funding to support the export to absorb the overcapacity in the Chinese system. So that's the economic logic. So what is the political or the diplomatic logic? That's where Xi Jinping's hegemonic stability theory comes into full play. So remember, one of the essential character or requirement for the hegemon in the hegemonic stability system is that the hegemon must provide public goods. And when China looks around in Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, it identifies the most desirable or most coveted public goods is infrastructure. But because of the lack of viability or the commercial viability of these projects, these countries are consistently starved for funding to support their infrastructure development. So Belt and Road Initiative is to begin with a geo-economic campaign that Xi Jinping designed to provide infrastructure as a public good to the less developed countries that do not have funding for this type of development. But eventually the goal is to rebuild China's image or build China's glory and persuasiveness as a hegemon and a benevolent hegemon. The logic is this: if China is willing to use its own funding to support the domestic growth or domestic development of Sri Lanka or of Pakistan, then China is using its own funding and using its own experience to engineer economic development and potentially engineer social change. So what is more benevolent than that? At least that is the thinking in Beijing when they came up with Belt and Road Initiative. And that's why we're seeing that Belt and Road Initiative essentially extends first around China's periphery from the Korean Peninsula to Mongolia and through Central Asia, and the maritime Silk Road goes through Southeast Asia, then through South Asia, through Middle East, well, with a touch of Africa, and eventually both roads will lead to Europe. So this is the way that Xi Jinping believes that will demonstrate China's hegemonic benevolence. So the next slide, please. What is the problem? What is the most important obstacle that Xi Jinping has encountered in this process? It's the United States. Because when China tries to reassert its hegemonic role in Asia to begin with, and then to the broader grand periphery of China, it realizes that the first problem it has encountered, and the largest problem, is the United States. Because US has maintained a security alliance system in the West Pacific since the end of World War II. So US has always maintained its role. You could call it offshore balancer. Some would call it a balancer to prevent the emergence of a hegemon in the Eurasia continent. But when China starts to exert, well, flex its muscles and try to exert its influence as a regional hegemon, the first pushback it has encountered is from the United States. And here we're looking at a US alliance system. We're having alliance in South Korea, in Japan, in Philippines, in Australia, and also in Southeast Asia. Thailand is still our ally, and we have security arrangements with a number of Southeast Asian countries. So the Chinese realized that when they first tried to push out to impose their rules, for example, in South China Sea, to other claimant countries, the first obstacle and the pushback it encounters is from the United States. And next slide, please. And that's where we have the Chinese realize that, oh, wait a minute, there's a first island chain, and then there's a second island chain. And from north to south, the Chinese realized in order for it to re-establish or reassert its role as a regional hegemon and potentially a global hegemon someday, it will first have to encounter and also to overcome the obstacle called the United States. So when China looks at its periphery and looks at its most immediate national security concerns, from north to south, there are 4 issues on China's eastern coast, so on the West Pacific. And that's from the north is Korean Peninsula, and under Korean Peninsula is the East China Sea, where China has territorial and maritime dispute with Japan, a security ally of the United States. Then beneath the East China Sea, we also have Taiwan, that we have been talking about Taiwan contingency for quite a number of years now. And then last but not least, there's also the South China Sea issue, where China has maritime disputes with both Philippines and Vietnam. So what the Chinese used to say is that, if you recall, back in 2015, when President Xi Jinping paid I believe it was a state visit to Washington, D.C., he met with President Obama, and he told Obama, he looked at President Obama in the eyes and promised that, well, Pacific Ocean is large enough to accommodate both US and China. And that is something that Chinese president said with full sincerity. Although every Chinese statement always comes with a caveat. So later it was revealed that what he said was essentially the first half of the sentence. The Pacific Ocean is large enough for both US and China. Although what he did not say is the second half of the sentence, which is, why don't you stay on your half? So what the Chinese essentially see in the West Pacific is that China is trying to extend and reclaim its rightful place in the international arena. And by history, China sees as its rightful role in the Asia Pacific, or in the Asia region, is a regional hegemon. And China as a hegemon will be able to carry out this hegemonic stability system in the region, but it realizes that the US presence is the most significant challenge to the role that China is trying to reclaim. And that's why when the Chinese look at US role in the Asia Pacific, it does recognize that, well, US has an intrinsic role to play because US has its alliances and systems in the region. But what the Chinese have objected very overtly is the notion that US is US is a Pacific country, but US is not an Asian country. What it means essentially for the Chinese policy playbook is that while US is allowed to be present in Asia, US does not have the innate legitimacy to participate in the rulemaking in Asia. And if you recall back in 2014, when Xi Jinping declared that Asia is Asians' Asia, that's essentially what Xi Jinping is trying to say. And that lays the foundation, or I would say is the best example of how China sees the relationship with the United States. in the Asia region, especially focused on West Pacific, and why there is a structural problem that does not afford any easy solution. Next slide, please. So from north to south, 4 problems. To begin with, there's the Korean Peninsula. We know that North Korea has nuclear capability. Some assess them to be the level of 50 warheads. North Korea is also eagerly and assiduously developing their intercontinental ballistic missile capability. Their Hwasans 18, Hwasan 19 is rumored or is reported to have the capability to reach the continental United States. North Korea's vision, while US and China have different views about what North Korea's vision and strategy essentially looks like, because North Korea has already written their nuclear weapons into their constitution. So the going wisdom is that denuclearization of North Korea is not going to happen unless there is a change of regime. But the catch-22 is that if the regime faces any change, it is willing to use nuclear weapons in order to prevent that change. So for North Korea's vision, whether denuclearization of North Korea is still viable is a highly debated subject, and it's also a subject of debate between US and China. Because when you look at North Korea's great power strategy, historically being invaded by China by 900 times, there is a term that North Korea calls China is 1,000-year enemy. So when North Korea looks at its great power strategy, there's a very strong argument that North Korea, in fact, has a desire to improve its relationship with the United States in order to counterbalance China's dominance on the Korean Peninsula. US and China have engaged in some contingency planning related to North Korea back in 2017. But I think that historical episode is forever gone and is unlikely to come back, because with the emergence or the exacerbation of the great power competition, what we're seeing is China is increasingly hoarding North Korea as a strategic asset or as a strategic leverage that it will use to bargain with the United States or to trigger, the Chinese call it, we're going to activate North Korea as a potential distraction in the event of a Taiwan contingency. So what we're seeing is that North Korea's strategic utility in China's grand strategy vis-a-vis the United States has increased significantly in the past number of years, despite the deterioration of relationship between China and North Korea bilaterally. So that is the hard issue of the Korean Peninsula lying on the north tip of the West Pacific friction between US and China. Next slide, please. And then we look at the East China Sea. This is an issue where we're looking at, so China and Japan are faced with a competition or a dispute in terms of the Diaoyu Sankaku Island, which is to the north of the Taiwan island. And other than the territorial sovereignty of the island, China and Japan are also engaged in maritime dispute. Why is this region important? Well, a lot of people have cited for example, the natural resources, whether it's fishing resources as well as natural gas reserves in the seabed in the East China Sea. But the more essential issue for China is a strategic location, because Diaoyu Sankaku Island, or overall the East China Sea, the sea lane of communication represents a choke point. If the Chinese Navy wants to access the Pacific, remember the first island chain, it has to pass through certain choke points in order to access the Pacific Ocean. And Diaoyu Sankaku Island and this narrow waterway between Taiwan and Diaoyu Sankaku Island forms one such choke point. So therefore, East China Sea, this particular region, has a specific importance for the Chinese PLA Navy. China and Japan also disagrees on the regional security framework or what the future regional security outlook for East Asia should look like. Why? Because Japan has traditionally, or since 1947, has been used to the fact of a US-Japan security alliance being the pillar or being the founding stone of US grand strategy in the region and also for the regional security architecture. But what the Chinese have envisioned, like I have explained for the first half of this presentation, is a hegemonic stability theory. It's a hegemonic stability arrangement where China as a hegemon will command the respect and deference of countries in the region. And when China perceives that Japan is intending to introduce an external hegemon in order to counterbalance China, it represents a direct collision of two very different strategic outlook for the East Asia region. And on this particular point, the Chinese would argue that South Korea potentially will be more likely to identify, especially the progressives in South Korea, are more likely to identify with a China-dominated hegemonic stability system in East Asia compared to Japan. So when we look at U.S.-Japan security alliance and its application on the East China Sea, it's not just a matter of a remote island in the ocean, but it is also about essentially what the future regional security outlook and its architecture should look like. Next slide, please. And here's that remote island. It's not habitable. There's no water and there's no people living on it. Japan has built a beacon, a light tower on the Senkaku Island, but it currently does not have anyone stationed on the island. So a remote island, but represents a much bigger friction in terms of the regional security architecture in East Asia. Next slide, please. And then we look at Taiwan. Taiwan Strait, somewhere around 100 miles long in terms of the distance between the Fujian province and the west coast of Taiwan. People have debated the imminence of the timeline because U.S. has a security commitment to Taiwan, not only per the Taiwan Relations Act, which is domestic legislation that the executive branch must fulfill, must abide by, but also by our commitment, such as the 6 reassurances that we have provided to Taiwan in the 1980s. There has been an interesting debate as for whether Xi Jinping sees 2027 or 2032 as a deadline for his invasion of Taiwan or for the unification of Taiwan. Because when we talk about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, Xi Jinping's headline in terms of his government, a prominent argument is that if Xi Jinping does not achieve national unification, then the national rejuvenation that he is trying to achieve is nowhere to start. That how could China be rejuvenated if China is still not unified? I think by that token, people do believe that Xi Jinping has a sense of urgency coming to the issue of unification. But the status quo of this Taiwan Strait, which is not independent, no Taiwan independence and no unification between Taiwan and mainland China, has been preserved since 1949. And when we look at U.S. policy is committed to the status quo of the Taiwan Strait. It's not necessarily committed to a designated result, whether it's unification or it's independence of Taiwan. U.S. position is that question, the future of Taiwan, will have to be decided by the people of Taiwan and people of Taiwan only. The Chinese disagree on this particular issue. They said, well, if there is going to be a decision made about the future of Taiwan, it needs to be made by the people in Taiwan and also people in China jointly. While the population of Taiwan is 23 million and the population in China is 1.4 billion. So there's no competition there. We often see that there's a debate as for who is changing the status quo. China's modernizing its military. China is using gray zone activities to launch cognitive warfares or psychological warfares on the Taiwanese people. And on the other hand, we also have to acknowledge that Taiwanese people do not want unification. If they get to choose, if there's no consequences to their choice, they would opt for independence of Taiwan long time ago. But because of the concern about a potential military invasion from China, Taiwan has maintained this current status quo for more than 7 decades. We ask which side the time is on, whose side is time on. And it's interesting to see that China and Taiwan has very different answers. From a U.S. point of view, of course, we will see that time is on Taiwan's side because the Taiwanese people, as time passes by, will be less and less likely to aspire for unification with the authoritarian Communist Party and with a leader such as Xi Jinping himself. But the Chinese have a different vision. Their vision is that, remember, going back to the hegemonic competition in West Pacific, the Chinese believe that there will be a day when the United States, as a declining hegemon, will be so exhausted by a security commitment to an island so far away from its homeland. Until that day comes, the political will of Taiwan to negotiate unification with mainland China is not going to emerge. So in the Chinese calculus, the answer to the question whose side is time on does not depend on Taiwan or what Taiwanese people will aspire. In the end, it depends on the perseverance or the consistency of U.S. ability and U.S. commitment to defend Taiwan, regardless of the decline of the relative decline of the U.S. comprehensive national power, and also regardless of the U.S. other priorities. So that's an interesting debate that we have been seeing between China and Taiwan. PLA has been developing its capability. We would say that if you look at the hardware capability, PLA has developed some very keen and very advanced capabilities. But we always question that whether the software, meaning the command and control, meaning the internal dynamics of the PLA, is suitable for the military, for the Chinese military to launch the attack on Taiwan. And what I'm specifically talking about is the corruption cases and the continued repeated purge of the PLA leadership. The most recent round of purge, as people who observe this might follow, started, 2 years ago, it was a strategic rocket force that was completely purged from the top to the bottom. Then in the most recent round in last November, Miao Hua, a member of the Central Military Commission, also the political commissar of PLA, was also purged. This most recent March, so 3 months ago, we also saw the vice chair of the Central Military Commission, He Weidong, disappeared from public eyes. And the development has suggested that the PLA's purge has not stopped. Then the question is, well, when the PLA leaders and the generals are all looking behind their own back and worried about the investigation from the party into their own financial or into their own private lives, then what is their capability? Well, what is their resolve to fight a war on Taiwan for that particular leadership? But everyone agrees that if there is going to be a war over Taiwan Strait, it will be a bad war. It potentially will be World War III, and it potentially will generate the use of nuclear weapons, especially if the Chinese Communist Party government just stands to lose. And the logic is quite clear that if China is going to lose the war vis-a-vis the United States over Taiwan, then most likely Taiwan is going to become independent. And most likely the Chinese Communist Party and whoever the leader will be losing his or her, well, most likely his legitimacy. So the question is, if the party sees this potential loss as an existential threat, are they still going to be combined or confined by their no first use principle? Or maybe they will perceive that U.S. will have already developed a plan. If U.S. does not stand to win in that Taiwan contingency, then maybe U.S. will use tactical nuclear weapons and China will respond in return. But in essence, in terms of Taiwan, which is, I would say, the most acute manifestation of a hegemonic China and a U.S. as a regional hegemon, I would say that is reflected in the case of Taiwan. And that's why the stake is also significantly more dire compared to the other issues in the region. Next slide, please. And then we look at South China Sea, which is the southmost dispute or the friction between U.S. and China. We have had overlapping claims in terms of territorial claims and maritime claims between China and 4 Southeast Asian countries in the region. But when we look at South China Sea, next slide, please. A couple of caveats that we have been discussing. So first, for China, South China Sea is not an issue between China and Southeast Asia, because in the Chinese definition, if there's no U.S. interference, there's no issue. the Southeast Asian countries would have complied or be coerced by China to follow the rules that China developed as a hegemon. Remember, going back to the hegemonic stability, the Chinese would implement a set of rules that essentially will make Southeast Asian claimant countries accept the reality. But because U.S. is supporting Philippines, U.S. has supported Vietnam, so these countries feel that they have a reasonable chance to have a fight, which is why in China, South China Sea is not regarded as an issue between China and Southeast Asia, but a U.S.-China issue. And the problem, going back to the hegemonic stability, is who dominant in the rulemaking. The Chinese have come up with rules called let's shelve the dispute and pursue joint development. And in the Chinese definition, that is a perfect solution to the maritime disputes that China has with Vietnam and the Philippines. Let's shelve the dispute over the sovereignty and let's focus on the joint development of the natural resources. But if you're Vietnam or if you are the Philippines, your answer would be, if this is my territory, why would we share it with you? So the exclusivity of the Chinese dominance is what the Chinese are trying to pursue. And again, it clashes with the U.S. Advancement, with U.S. support of the international rules and norms in the region. And within Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, the maritime Southeast Asia have very different views. If you look at mainland Southeast Asian countries, they very much do not have a preference as for how the Southeast Asia, how the South China Sea dispute would be resolved. In fact, some of them, including, for example, Cambodia, have supported the Chinese approach. So the division within Southeast Asia is another issue that we're seeing China trying to exploit as a regional great power. And the case of Philippines, of course, Philippines is our treaty ally. We have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, which is categorically different from the case of Vietnam, because Vietnam, remember, the biggest issue for Vietnam is that Vietnam is also ruled by a communist party. So between China and Vietnam, there's always the consideration that for the solidarity of the two communist parties, the parties oftentimes dictate the policy and tell the militaries and tell the two governments to take a different position in terms of their maritime dispute. So again, when we look at the U.S.-China friction in the South China Sea, is at times it's very tense, but it's also very difficult to compete with the issue of Taiwan. So examining the four issues between US and China in the West Pacific, what I'm trying to present essentially is that Xi Jinping's vision of China as a hegemon imposing and creating and enforcing stability in the Asia region, in the Asia Pacific region, is the underlying cause, or this structural cause of the friction between US and China in this particular region. Who is going to win? We do not know the answer to that question, but we have seen China encountering many pushbacks from countries in the region, meaning that the countries in the region do not necessarily prefer a returning to the hegemonic stability system that China would like to pursue and install. But it also depends on how US is going to react to the China threat and to the Chinese pursuit of a hegemonic stability system in the region. And honestly, with the Trump administration, a lot of countries in the region do have their doubts, and they would like to have the options, right? You often hear countries in the region telling the United States, don't force us to choose. But the reality is that they do enjoy to have the options. But now with the US retrenchment, or what is perceived to be a potential US retrenchment from the region, I think the regions in the countries in the region are feeling that they have much less option in terms of the grand strategies that they are allowed to pursue. And that has significant implication to both the Chinese grand strategy and US strategic future in the region. So the next slide, please. Last but not least, just very quickly want to discuss about the China secular theater, especially focused on South Asia, because this is also an issue that we hear a lot in the Indo-Pacific strategy discussion, that what is Indo-Pacific strategy? It's Asia-Pacific plus India, right? So what role that India can play in our our strategic competition with China? So for China, the first risk that they identify in terms of the Indian Ocean theater or the secondary theater is their energy supply. After all, 53% of their crude oil import still comes from the Middle East and still has to pass this sea line of communication. And they identify two risks. The first one is instability affects the supply, the production of oil and natural gas. And what we're seeing today between Iran and Israel belongs to this first category. And the second risk is potential U.S. disruption of transportation. That's the Malacca dilemma that people have loved to talk about since early 2000. Especially in the event of a Taiwan contingency, the expectation is that U.S. is going to disrupt the Chinese import or the Chinese energy security, energy transportation from the Middle East. How have the Chinese designed or approached their response? They see themselves as susceptible, which is very true, but they don't necessarily see themselves as vulnerable. And this is primarily because they see that the U.S. does have the ability to disrupt the Chinese supply. But at the same time, China has been trying to decrease its vulnerability by one, diversifying its oil supply. If you recall, in 2024, the largest supplier of crude oil to China is not Saudi Arabia, it's not Iraq, it's in fact Russia. Russia, as a single country, provided 19.6% of China's crude oil import in 2026. And China also had developed the pipelines from Central Asia, from Russia, in order to diversify its energy import. Another reason that the Chinese feel less vulnerable despite the fact that they're susceptible, is also because the Chinese have been building up their strategic reserves at home, on top of diversifying their own energy supply. Remember, the Chinese are trying to build more, while the rate of the Chinese build up of the third generation nuclear reactors is higher than any country in the world. In fact, I suspect it is higher than all the rest of the world combined in terms of the number of nuclear reactors that China is trying to build. It's also a matter of the Chinese building up their strategic reserves, given the opportunity of cheap Russian oil. Because of the Russian war in Ukraine, the Chinese have been significantly filling their strategic reserves domestically. The Chinese have debated whether it is worthwhile to have a security presence in the Middle East to protect their oil supply. The answer so far is no. Why? Because they realize that, one, their primary theater is focused on the Pacific Ocean. So the majority of their defense budget has to be put in the preparation for Taiwan contingency, which means that the money that they can spend or allocate in terms of security presence in the Middle East is extremely small, especially compared to a well-established U.S. security presence in the region. The Chinese don't necessarily feel they have a chance to catch up to the United States in the near future. So last, there's a question of India. India and Pakistan just had their most recent crisis in May, and we have seen the result transferring that the Chinese military or their defense cooperation with Pakistan have borne fruit. So the question of India remains to be a curious one because they do have a land dispute, but I think from a U.S. perspective, India will have more advantage in terms of the Indian Ocean region or in the maritime domain compared to the land border. Because on the land border, India faces a problem of two-front war with both the disputed border with China and also disputed border with Pakistan. So on that, the jury is still out. And last slide, please. Thank you. That's a very long monologue about what China's strategy looks like. So I'd be happy to have some discussion or questions. Happy to entertain any ideas or comments that you might have.